Everyone, Mr. G here. I hope you guys are doing well. Today we are going to talk about the U.S. joining World War One. So you'll need the graphic organizer called U.S. and World War One. So why this matters? First of all, we're going to talk about the Lusitania, which is a really important event in U.S. history. The sinking of the Lusitania by a German U-boat. The Zimmerman note is one of the most important pieces of, well, intercepted pieces of communications between the Germans and the Mexican government, which is very interesting, which we'll talk about. And this matters a lot because it's going to shorten the war. So U.S. involvement is going to shorten the war dramatically, um, according to some historians. Other historians disagree and actually say that the war might have ended sooner had America not joined in, but that's a minority of historians, at least. And then this is going to show you guys how the U.S. military is going to get mobilized for war, which is not an easy thing to do. And then finally, this matters because World War II is right around the corner. And as you'll see in this lecture, there's some pretty clear connections between World War I and World War II. And our big question today is, why did the U.S. join World War I, and what effect did it have on the war? Okay. So this, to give you guys a visual, is the trench line. It's about 450 miles from Switzerland all the way up to Belgium. And you have the Germans, the Central Powers on this side, and you've got the Allies on the other side. So we've got the British and French fighting right now along this long trench line. Okay, so my first question for you guys today is, who wins in a fight? We've got a machine gun nest on the left and an entire company of French infantry on the right with bayonets ready, and they're ready to charge. So who do you think wins? Well, if you pick the machine gun nest, you're probably right. In World War One, it didn't matter how many troops you ended up throwing at machine gun nests. Ones like these, this is a German Maxim machine gun, would be able to mow down rows of these troops easily. So if you have about 10 of these, they would just wipe out any group of soldiers that would try to attack you. And if you try and shoot at them, they're dug in inside of the trench. So it's very hard to hit them while these guys have no cover. Okay, so we're still in World War One, but right now there's a bit of a stalemate. So as we talked about before, trench warfare, or as you guys learned about in that video, trench warfare is incredibly difficult to fight because it's very hard to take enemy territory because the enemy territory is in a ditch and you have to cross an open field to get there. The attacking force usually suffers massive casualties, as you guys already know. Charging a machine gun nest from previous lectures usually ends terribly. And we have a 450-mile trench line that I mentioned previously that stretches from about Switzerland to Belgium. So there's nowhere for you to outflank the enemy. You can't go around them because there's just another trench. So there are two battles that kill, wound, or have missing soldiers of about 2 million. So that's two battles and 2 million casualties. The battles of Verdun and the Somme, where you see this trench warfare really come into effect, where you have rows and rows of French and British soldiers getting mowed down by German machine gun fire, and because the generals simply don't understand or choose not to understand that the tactics aren't working. And this is all taking place on the Western Front. So the Western Front is going to be between France, Germany, and Belgium. So that was that first map I showed you. So just a good visual here. I know it's a little blurry, but this is another visual to show you how hard it is to attack a trench. So if you are these guys here, you've got to make it past barbed wire, a first trench, a second trench, and a third trench, all while being hit by artillery, which is all the way back here, machine guns, and all of the men with rifles that are in the trench. So you have no cover. You have to get through barbed wire. They can see you from the air. If it's later in the war, the Germans and both sides will start to use aircraft a lot more. And you're also crossing a place called No Man's Land, which you guys have learned about before, but it's basically a wet, muddy, gross, bombed out mess with bodies and diseases. And some of these shell holes right here, these artillery holes right here, are actually much deeper than you might think. So if you're this guy and you fall in, you might drown before you even get to the trench. Um, anyway, so this is a quick video on the Lusitania that explains the sinking of it in great detail. It's a short video. I have the link here below if you guys want to type that in, and I'll also put the link on Google Classroom for you. I'm also going to put this PowerPoint up for you guys to use this embedded video. So you guys can move on after you watch this. So the Zimmerman note. I talked about this a little bit earlier. What it was is a note from the German foreign minister, whose name is Arthur Zimmermann, in 1917, and he's going to send a telegraph to Mexico. And he's saying, look, if the US declares war on Germany, the Mexicans should declare war on the US. And this is proposed to the Mexicans in exchange for Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. So if Mexico joined the Germans against the Americans, Mexico would get back these territories that it lost, or these states that it lost in the Mexican-American War. Unfortunately for the Germans, the message is intercepted by the British. So British being fairly close allies of the United States, even though we're not technically in the war yet. And this message is released to the public, and it shocks everybody. This is kind of like the final straw that breaks the camel's back. This takes place after the sinking of the Lusitania, and soon enough, Wilson declares war April 2nd, 1917. And there is the German foreign minister, Arthur Zimmermann. Great facial hair, not so great at sending messages and not having them getting intercepted. And this is the New York Times. So this was the New York Times headline. Germany seeks an alliance against US, asks Japan and Mexico to join her, and the full text of the proposal was made public. So here we are when the US finally joins the party, a little late, actually pretty late. Remember, the war's been going on since 1914, and we jump in April of 1917. So we've stayed out of it for about 3 years. But before we get there, Russia has a communist revolution led by Vladimir Lenin. So during this time period, Russia, well, right before the revolution, Russia was controlled by the Tsar. There was a revolution that, who is basically like, you might think of him as a authoritarian, kind of like, it's the Russian word for king. So you can kind of understand his relationship with the Russians. He is overthrown by a revolution, and then that government is overthrown by Vladimir Lenin's revolution. The important thing to remember about that is that Russia is going to drop out of the war after this communist revolution and become the Soviet Union in the 1920s officially. The effect that this has on the war immediately is that Germany no longer has to fight the Russians in the east, so they can send all their troops to the west. So the US joins in, and there are some immediate effects. So first of all, the US joins in allied convoys. So these convoys are shipping convoys that are going to go across the ocean, the Atlantic, and they're going to protect shipping, and they're going to limit the capacity of U-boats, remember those German submarines, to sink ships and to prevent supplies from coming overseas. So these convoys are actually very successful in resupplying the British and French. The next effect is that the U.S. forces are actually going to help defend the key parts of the trench lines and the defensive line set up by the Allies. And they're going to help wear down this massive German offensive, pretty much the last German offensive of the war that takes place in 1918, the last year of the war. Also, U.S. forces are going to take back territory from Germans, which is very, very, very difficult for the reasons we talked about before. And this is the Battle of, I might not pronounce this correctly, it's Belleau-Wood, I believe. And this is a picture, a famous picture of Americans who they were new to the fight, so a lot of people called them. They had the nickname Doughboys with a machine gun, and we've got a soldier here, and they're storming through this torn up, shot to pieces. This is probably no man's land right here. Okay, so the end of the war. With the arrival of the United States, the Allies will gain a manpower and supply advantage. So now we have American troops joining the fight, and we have the American economy in full swing. On the other side, the Central Powers, so Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire, they're running low on supplies, low on morale, meaning their soldiers don't want to fight anymore. And that's going to lead to desertion, mutinies, and refusal to fight. So that means if you're a soldier, a German soldier, and your officer tells you, hey, let's go over to the top of the trench line and go attack the French, you might say no, you might refuse. You might say, I'm getting the heck out of Dodge, and you might run away. Or you can mutiny, which means you and your fellow soldiers might have your captain disappear or officer accidentally dies somehow. That's common in wars when one side is not doing very well and the officers are still enthusiastic about fighting. That will actually happen in Vietnam among American soldiers. But moving on. So the actual end of the war takes place at 11 a.m. on November 11th, 1918, in a train car, which is very, very, very important. Uh, kind of. So Germany surrenders in a train car. This is the delegation. We've got French, British, and Germans here, I believe. And overall, the war does end, and on both sides, about 13 million people die. So this is including both sides. Sorry, 13 million. That's just military dead. We also have 6.5 million civilians dead, which is, I mean, this is an insane number of people to die in a war without a directly clear um, goal past territorial expansion and alliances. So that train car that you guys saw um, right here comes back. In World War II, when the Germans invade France, they make the French sign a treaty of surrender or a document of surrender in the same train car that the French made the Germans sign a treaty of surrender in the First World War. So if you notice who this is, that's Hitler. He is in the same train car, and the French delegation is on the right. And it's designed to humiliate the French because Hitler and the Germans were humiliated, uh, or they feel that they were humiliated after the First World War. So they want to sign the same treaty after they beat the French in the Second World War in the same train car. And that is the French delegation getting on. And you can clearly see that's the same train car as before. So with that, that's the end of today's lecture. I hope you guys are all doing well and have a great rest of your day.